It was still there, the listing for the house on the hill. I wondered if anyone else saw the beauty in its decay, or just the ghosts.
I was in my early 20s when this occurred. 3 other guys and I used to share a tiny house. Although we attended the same college and graduated at the same time, we didn't really know one another until moving in together. We're all searching for somewhere. Thus, after that, everything kind of fell into place. We were able to afford a modest home on the more rural outskirts of the city by splitting the rent 4 ways. The cost of everything closer was a little too high. For the first 9 or so months, everything went smoothly. However, 2 of the guys abruptly chose to move out, leaving just KJ and me. Regretfully, out of the 3, KJ was the only one with whom I didn't really communicate. He didn't want to spend time with the rest of us, was constantly working, or arrived home late. That the other 2 were the ones who departed was kind of a bummer. It also meant that we each of us had to pay twice as much. We decided to part ways and vacate the house when the lease expired in 3 months, because we couldn't continue with this. KJ's absence was particularly noticeable within the first month following their departure. Every day that I had off, I was unlike when the other 2 lived here. I was frequently at home by myself, relaxing all day and night. I didn't give a damn. If anything, it was wonderful to have the apartment to myself, although I did find it strange that he was always gone for so long. He only had a part-time job in the mornings, but I assumed he spent every night out with buddies. I did, however, happen to stay up a bit later than normal one night. It was probably around 1 in the morning when I was sitting in my room. I heard the front door open and noticed headlights shining through my window as I drove down the gravel path. I felt compelled to say hello as soon as I got up in order to prevent our relationship from becoming too aloof and uncomfortable. I was a little taken aback when I heard his voice as I opened the door to my bedroom. Footsteps start racing down the corridor. He leaped as if I had caught him in the act when I pushed my head out. His eyes were wide, and his body was frozen, just outside his bedroom door, but I couldn't see him very clearly because the lights in the corridor were out. "KJ, what's going on?" I broke the pause by saying, "Just checking in to see how you're doing." It was a little unsettling how he just stood in the dimly lit hallway, staring at me with his eyes wide open. "I'm doing fine." A couple more seconds passed, of quiet, after which I simply nodded and returned to my room. That certainly didn't make our relationship any less awkward. Why was he running to his room and acting so strangely? It kind of worried me, but I didn't want to seem intrusive. A few minutes later, I opened my door, proceeded along the corridor in silence and with caution. As I walked by his room, all I wanted to do was listen for a moment. However, as soon as I did, I heard him hastily opening and closing drawers. It was so strange that I paused for a moment and leaned slightly toward his door. I was really uncomfortable as the chaos persisted, until all of a sudden, there was silence. As if he had been frozen, everything halted. As the seconds passed, I became more and more uncomfortable and wanted to leave that hallway. However, the door abruptly opened before I could even move. KJ was standing in the doorway, staring at me with the same wide open eyes. I inquired if he wanted anything and pretended that I was simply going to the kitchen in an attempt to protect myself. With a low no, KJ shut the door behind me. It was genuinely rather unsettling, and it only strengthened my suspicions that something was wrong with him. After completing what I had spoken in the kitchen, I returned to my room. He remained silent for the remainder of the night. I became increasingly aware of what KJ was doing throughout the course of the next 5 or 6 days. Till I knew he was in his room and not doing anything, I would remain up till he returned home, because I was usually too uncomfortable to sleep. He continued to exist in that unsettling, somewhat zombie-like state for those days that he spent that particular evening. Every day his eyes became more and more agitated, and he would only say a few words before rushing into his room. One night, after he returned home, I was trying to fall asleep in bed when there was a knock on my door. I was afraid of it. He never came down the hall to my room that I could hear. I stood up and unlocked the door. His eyes were restless, yet he also had a half smile. He said he had just arrived home and believed he had left his wallet on the driveway. He approached the door and asked if I had a torch so he could quickly locate it. It seemed odd to me that he had never actually asked for assistance or to do anything with him. Even though I was exhausted and found it strange, I reasoned that perhaps this was an opportunity to improve things. I followed him out to the driveway after grabbing a flashlight. He struck up a conversation, asking about job and other things. I saw fairly immediately that his car was parked well down the driveway as we began to stroll on the gravel and take in our surroundings. However, for what seems like no reason, all the way to the conclusion. In order to find his wallet, we had to walk the same distance as him. I never saw anything on the ground as we descended all the way to his car. However, he then began guiding me away from the vehicle. While I continued to shine the light, I became aware that his wallet had no business being so far from the driveway. "What were we doing?" I asked. KJ said he went for a quick walk after pausing for a few seconds, as if he was contemplating. I didn't really believe him, even if he might have slipped it out here earlier. He persisted in attempting to guide me farther into the woods and away from the driveway. He would constantly try to talk me out of it whenever I suggested that we go back. It became really suspicious very quickly. I could feel my anxiety rising. "You may take the flashlight here. I'm going to return home. In any case, I have to get up early for work tomorrow." As I attempted to give him the torch and head out, but he didn't accept it. His restless eyes appeared more than dissatisfied, and his obviously artificial smile vanished. He appeared irate. He remained silent, but the eye was feeling really uncomfortable due to tension. I instantly turned around and left the woods after a short while. I glanced back a few times and saw KJ merely observing me. I began packing as soon as I arrived at the house. I was unaware if I didn't feel secure around him, regardless of what that was. KJ never returned to the house that night, so I stayed, up all night listening to make sure he wasn't up to anything else. I packed everything crucial into my car in the morning and on the left. Years later, I still didn't hear from KJ or understand the situation. His actions weren't typical, and I genuinely believe he had a terrible plan to do something in the woods that evening. My college roommate Jason and I shared a little home close to our former campus for 2 years. Even though we had shared a room at college for a year before to this, we weren't really close friends or anything. We simply moving in together made reasonable for the time being since they both had similar post-college aspirations. The first year or so was rather successful. We grew closer and had so much fun living together that we decided to extend the lease for another year. This occurred 2 months ago in June. Following a lease renewal, after a typical late night at work, I returned home and spent some time chatting with Jason. After that, we both went to bed and called it a night. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, the floorboards were creaking in the corridor. They were moving slowly in the direction of the house's main area. When I turned to face the clock and saw that it was 3 in the morning, I assumed Jason was simply getting some water or anything. I'm not sure. I simply went back to sleep because I didn't care at the moment. I had to depart early in the morning because I had to get to work early. However, Jason asked me a question that I wasn't answering when he opened his door, looking exhausted. Anticipating. I was strolling around the home in the middle of the night and he asked me why. I was shocked right away. I claimed not to be, but I believed I heard him moving around. However, that was essentially the end of the talk. I had to leave for work, so we were both perplexed by what we heard. To be honest, if it wasn't Jason, I assumed that our walls or floors were simply cracking from the wind blowing through the home. Jason was at work when I returned home. I therefore just relaxed in my room for the majority of the night. Eventually, I went to bed at the same time as last night. However, the floorboards were squeaking at the same time as I woke up. This time, instead of going, I attempted to pay closer attention as I went back to sleep. It sounded exactly like someone moving gently into the living room from the hallway. After they reached the other side of the house, I decided to get up and see how things were going, because I hadn't heard anything for about 30 seconds. When I went to the living room after opening my door, Jason wasn't there. Nothing there, as far as I could determine, could account for what I heard. I returned to my room and fell asleep. The peculiar thing about it, in my opinion, was that the sound traveled through the why did it move slowly across the house like that, if it was just the house creaking? When I brought it up to Jason in the morning, Neither of us could think of anything. Jason had the day off, but I had to report to work at 2. I failed to return to the residence until about 11 o'clock, at which point I left and headed to my room via the corridor. Jason was still up, which shocked me. I caught a glimpse of him sitting on his room's bed out of the corner of my eye. I yelled as I went by the doorway, "What's up?" Jason didn't reply as I moved to my room. It seemed strange to me, but perhaps he didn't hear me. I then proceeded to my room. I changed out of my work uniform and into some casual attire. When I went to get some food from the kitchen after leaving my room, I saw that Jason's light had gone out. I glanced in to check on him as I went by. I could hardly see him because he was still sitting on his bed in the corner in the dark. "Hey, Jason, how are you? Are you okay?" I yelled. He didn't answer for a few seconds, so I simply walked out of the doorway and into the kitchen. This was undoubtedly strange, but I had no idea how to do. I was obviously not going to just walk into his room and demand a response. However, it did seem really strange that he didn't at least say hello or something. I spent around 15 minutes in the kitchen before returning to my room. When I walked by Jason's door, it was closed. I was in my room for an hour before I heard that noise. In the hallway, the floors are squeaking. Abruptly, something moved beneath the door as I turned to see. I heard the creaking go on. However, because my last few encounters with Jason had been strange, I thought I would just text him this time to see if he was out and about. I waited for a few minutes. I eventually received an answer after that. I received a question mark from Jason, then, "What do you mean?" was the next question. "I'm not at home at the moment." My eyes darted to the door as my face turned pale. I sprang up and rushed into the corridor. The door to Jason's room was open once more, but no one was there. I stood silently and listened, but I heard nothing. I approached and looked through the door. An unidentified man stood in the middle of the completely dark room. Now that he was nearer and facing me, even in the dark, I could tell he had a bushy beard and was taller. There are 2 unique characteristics that set him apart from Jason and were previously invisible to me. I bolted from the house without hesitating. Standing on the other side of the road, I quickly called the police. Whoever that guy was, he was gone when they arrived. Oddly, other from a partially unlocked window that didn't appear to have been opened recently, there were no indications of where he entered or left the residence. What's truly unsettling is being aware that he was probably the reason the floorboards had been cracking in the middle of the night for the past few days, indicating that he was inside the home exploring while we slept. Finding out why he was in Jason's room, sitting on his bed and apparently waiting for something, is even more unsettling. Fascinatingly, during the past few days, Jason would spend the entire evening by himself because that was the one day I worked, and he had a day off. This leads me to believe that the unidentified individual was aware of this in some way and was waiting to surprise Jason while he was by himself. This would clarify why the man was waiting in Jason's room and why he didn't anything to me. Fortunately, though, Jason spent the majority of the evening hanging out with a friend. In any event, we most likely won't ever be aware of the genuine purposes of man till it's too late. When I was 23 years old in 2015, I looked for a roommate on Craigslist. I believe that using Craigslist to find roommates and other things was rather common back then. It wasn't as widely used as it is now, and there weren't many alternative places to do so. I made sure to mention that I was seeking for a roommate, ideally someone my own age, and a listing that included some images of my house. A woman named Hannah responded to me after just a few days. She claimed to be 23 years old and still enrolled in college. Additionally, based on everything we spoke over the phone, it felt like we may get along well. Roommates. I so planned for her to visit and take a look around. When she did, everything appeared to be fine. After we decided on a price and Hannah liked the place, she moved in with me in less than a week. She didn't quite look her age, I must admit. She was a little. She was taller than me and simply had an older, more mature appearance. However, I assumed it was nothing more than the fact that she appeared little older than her actual age. In any case, the first few days passed, and because I had work and she had college and work, we didn't really have time to get to know one another. The 5th day has passed since she had moved in, that I arrived at the apartment at approximately 1,000 p.m. after returning from work. I heard footsteps racing down the hall as soon as I opened the door, followed by a door slamming shut. Perplexed, I put my luggage down and turned to face the corridor that led to our 2 bedrooms. They had shut their door and the my door was open, but the light in their room was on. It seemed strange to me because I knew I had closed it before I left. If they were prying about my room, I was definitely uncomfortable with it. I entered and shut the door. After looking around, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Location, or as though it had been inspected, so I assumed it was nothing and carried on with my evening. After settling in, I spent some time in my room watching TV. I assumed Hannah was simply asleep since I didn't hear her in her bed for an entire hour. She had previously stated that she enjoyed going to bed early, but out of habit I happened to look at my bedroom door while watching TV. However, I saw something strange. Beneath the crack in the doorway there was a shadow. Behind my door she stood. She wasn't shifting. How much time had she spent standing there? Hannah. They remained still. I yelled once more. "Are you out there, Hannah?" After a few silent moments, the shadow gradually slid away from behind the door and along the corridor. Her bedroom door slammed behind her and I heard it. For a brief instant, that made my heart race. What did she do? After that, I locked my door and stayed up a little later than normal before going to bed. When I saw Hannah in the kitchen in the morning, I politely brought up I just wanted to know if she needed anything last night. The talk came to an abrupt end when she grinned and stated everything was good. I simply moved on since I didn't want to ruin our relationship so soon after she moved in, even if it seemed strange. Soon after, Hannah left and I went to work a few hours later. I arrived home at the same time as yesterday, entering a dark and silent apartment at around 10:30 at night. I figured she had already gone to bed because all the lights were off, including in her room. Trying not to wake her, I slipped into my bedroom and shut the door. I had a quick FaceTime with a friend before taking a shower to wind down for the evening and make plans to go to bed. Following. I thought I heard something outside my room when I was in there. I even briefly reduced the water pressure to listen, but I didn't hear anything, so I carried on with my shower as normal. I got out and dried off after finishing. However, when I checked that the hallway door was open and the doorway into my room was open, I hastily put on my clothes and peered into the corridor. Hannah wasn't making any noise in her room, and all the lights were still off. Now I was genuinely scared. I locked the door behind me. What's truly peculiar is that when I arrived home and entered my room, I was nearly certain that I had unintentionally locked the door. Naturally, I now assumed that I had simply forgotten, but I was determined to remember going forward. However, why did she initially open my door? Was my door ever opened by her? The entire area remained silent and dark, as if she was merely asleep and never left her room. What on earth was happening? Even though I tried to watch TV and relax for an additional hour, I was still rather rattled by what had happened. I simply didn't know Hannah well enough to comprehend all of this or know how to proceed. I continued to try to persuade myself that was something innocuous. She attempted to ask me a question, but she simply departed after seeing I was taking a shower. However, none of the other events that have occurred can be explained by that. I knew I needed to go to bed after that hour. Thus, I turned off everything, got into bed, and shut my eyes. My eyelids seemed to open again as soon as I closed them. I was aware that I had slept off, if briefly. I turned over and peered around, not knowing why I had woken up. The apartment was quiet and the room was completely dark. Not even a sound, just the quiet creaking of the ancient structure from the neighbors. However, I could see through the darkness that my room's door was slightly ajar. Perhaps only a few inches. However, that didn't lessen how immediately frightening it was. This time I was positive that I had locked it. Even more unsettling, I never heard it open. "Hannah," I whispered. As the seconds went by, I became more anxious since it seemed like the place's silence was growing louder. I sat up. I felt as though someone was watching me through the opening in the door, as I stared into the blackness between it. However, I glanced around the room once more as my eyes adapted to the darkness. I could see her form standing next to my closet in the corner. She stood in the dark facing me without moving or saying anything. My heart began to race with every passing second until she abruptly took a go-ahead. Even though I couldn't see her clearly, I could still make out the overall shape of her face, and she seemed to be staring through me. After taking another step, she abruptly bolted into the hallway and across the room. I heard her bedroom door slam a little later. Closed. After a little while, I ran to the front door and left the building after grabbing my phone and car keys. Although I am aware that she did not physically harm me, I was appalled. I was afraid she would run out looking for me, so I didn't even want to remain in the parking lot. After parking in a nearby area, I called the police in an attempt to find out what was happening with the nearby officer's safety. The police arrived at the flat in roughly 15 minutes. By then, Hannah had left, taken most of her possessions, and just disappeared. As we attempted to get in touch with her and identify her, we came to the realization that everything I knew about her was made up. Her phone number was for a prepaid burner phone, and even her name didn't match. It had no identification or a name. As I mentioned before, this was in 2015, so even 10 years later I haven't heard from or seen her again, which leads me to believe that she probably had some extremely unsettling plans if we had remained housemates. Her anymore? There are many questions and almost no answers. I moved flats after that because I was afraid the woman would return. When I don't anticipate it,